Hey, Bitches Bruze here with more on Flat Track Jam Starts. If you haven't watched it already, be sure to watch my video on the first 3 jam starts that I cover for this WFTDA Eastern Regionals bout between Philly and Gotham in October of 2010. We're going to start here with the 4th jam of my 10 jams and cover the different strategies that we see on the track between these two teams with different formations, different knee-down combinations, what goes right, what goes wrong for each of these teams. Our 4th clip takes a look at the 6th jam of the first period. Gotham's up 7 over Philly's 4, and everyone's on the track. What this clip looks at is a 3-1 formation versus a 2-2 formation. So let's take a look.
She is a force of nature, a force to be reckoned with.
Alright, so what just happened here? I've already mentioned that this is a Philly 3-1 versus a Gotham 2-2. This is not indicative of every 3-1 versus 2-2 play. It's just one of infinite possibilities of what can happen. But what's important to understand as we look at this play in slow motion is that Philly's 3 in the front is playing defense. Their 1 in the back is playing offense. Gotham's 2 in the back starts with playing defense. And their front 2 do a little bit of offense before they switch to defense, and their rear 2 come up to help with the defense. Let's take a look in slow motion. After the initial lineup, the jam start whistle blows, and all the blockers start moving forward. Once the first 5 blockers cross the pivot line, the jammer start whistle blows because those front 5 blockers form the pack, and there is more than 10 feet between them and the pair of Gotham blockers. The Gotham blockers, while they are not part of the pack, are still in play because they are more than 10 feet from the pack, but less than 20 feet. At the moment of this still, the Philly blocker in the back is not in play and cannot engage either the Gotham jammer or the Gotham blockers. Of course, once she's close enough to engage the Gotham blockers, if they're in play, of course she'll be in play as well. Our offensive Philly blocker does just that as she speeds up to block that defensive Gotham wall exactly at the pivot line where they'll do the most damage, opening up the outside for her own Philly jammer. She loses her footing in the hit, and those Gotham blockers close up on the line that the Philly jammer was taking. In the meantime, Gotham's jammer has a clear inside line, which the Philly front wall is about to try to close. A quick apex jump by the Gotham's jammer puts her past that entire front wall of Philly in lead before anyone can realize what's happening. The ease of that apex jump is mostly due to the success of the offensive work of Gotham's front pair of blockers. Let's scroll back and take a look and see what they did. Gotham's offensive blocking starts before the jam start whistle. That's why we're taking a look at this as part of jam starts. Their inside blocker starts in front and on the inside line, and while the initial contact starts off camera, she sweeps the inside line blocker of Philly off the inside line to the outside, opening up the inside line for her jammer, who 30 feet behind is seeing this opportunity open up. The middle Philly blocker is very smart, sees the inside line open, and goes to close that hole. But it is not enough with the apex jump to cover the inside line alone at this point on the track. This particular scenario works fantastic for Gotham, and we see a real quick lead jammer for Gotham out of this particular jam start. The next clip's really basic. Philly's skating short. They're down a pivot and a blocker. It's the 9th jam of the first period, so we're about halfway through, and Gotham is up 21-4. There's not a lot of Philly can do here, but they do the best they can with a really simple time burn with a bridge. Take a look. Philly does a pretty good job with this time burn, delaying the clock 4 to 5 seconds before the jammers are released. But where Gotham really succeeds in this play is where they force the jammer engagement to happen. They force the jammer engagement to happen in corner 2, which is the most difficult corner to defend at 15 feet wide, and with Philly only having 2 blockers, they can't afford to make any mistakes at this point, which they do. Their jammer tries to go for the inside, but doesn't quite make it. Their blocker leaves the inside on that hand touch. Gotham's jammer sees the hole and goes for it and gets lead. After a big power jam in Philly's advantage, by the 12th jam of the first period, the score is now 22 Gotham to 17 Philly. But Philly's finding itself with 2 blockers in their jammer in the penalty box, and Gotham's only down 1 blocker. Take a look at how this jam plays out.
That's near me.
Meanwhile, there's a great house in the box for Philly. I don't know about you fellas, but I know what greyhounds look like when they get unleashed from boxes, and they're pretty fast generally.
Jam clock now running with the jam clock.
It is Middlebury.
Penalty releases the jammer from the penalty box.
The greyhound getting forced by a mouse. My Gunner's getting forced to her knees. The greyhound looking for a hole on the outside. Meanwhile, the Bout's working her magic up and trying to keep running up.
Keep in mind when watching this video that knee-down starts were a pretty new concept in the fall of 2010. By the time the WFTDA championships happened later in the year, we saw more knee-downs from every team that's out there. But here in the fall at Eastern Regionals, it was mostly Philly doing the knee-down starts to force the jammers to be released early. If you ignore that for a moment, you can see Philly very successfully burn 16 seconds by counting on Gotham's rear wall to try to maintain their rear position. That time burn manages to get their jammer released. It takes 37 seconds for Gotham to get their lead jam, and in that time, Philly also manages to get a third blocker released from the box. Philly's jammer breaks through about 20 feet behind Gotham's jammer. So this is a pretty successful jam, considering what a disadvantage Philly had when the jam whistle blew compared to Gotham. Let's take a look at that in slow motion. Philly's pivot is occupying the pivot line like many good pivots did in 2010, all while keeping an eye on the penalty box, which is located just outside the track between the jammer and pivot lines. In that box are 2 of her blockers, her jammer, and a Gotham blocker. I can't explain why Gotham's rear pair of blockers allowed this long time burn, except perhaps their instructions were to hold the back at all costs until they lost their opposing jammer, then to re-engage her. Certainly it is in Philly's interest to not skate over that pivot line, or at least allow the jammer release whistle to not blow until their jammer is released. Once Gotham sees the Philly jammer stand, they seem to point at her, and sometime close to her release time, they take off. Philly follows, and the jammers are released with Philly's jammer coming in behind Gotham's jammer. Philly's pair of their pivot and blocker do a fantastic job with assisted blocking to keep Gotham's jammer in the pack and give her an awful lot of trouble. That is until they come around to corner 4, at which point in time their wall staggers in the wrong direction, giving Gotham's jammer a chance to juke and jump through. Philly's pivot partially recovers from the mistake and manages to delay the Gotham blocker for another half a lap. But Gotham's jammer does make lead 37 seconds into the jam. 7 seconds later, Philly's jammer takes advantage of the confusion and breaks through the front of the pack herself. Not bad, considering she didn't start the jam until 17 seconds after the Gotham jammer. I think what I like most about this clip that you're about to see is that it demonstrates to us that knee downs don't always have to just be used to deal with skaters in the box. Watch how Philly uses the knee down start to manage pack positioning after the jammer start whistle.
It's that she emits some sort of scent or foul odor when she is excited and waves it around on her tail to try to scare other animals. So you should keep your eyes peeled for that.
Hyperlinks jamming for Gotham runs into Teflon Donna. Anna Bullock comes up to help out to try to make a hole for Hyperlinks. She takes advantage. Your lead jammer for Gotham, Hyperlinks.
All right, back to our slow motion. In this jam, at the beginning, we see 2 of Philly's blockers take a knee just before the jam start whistle. Since they haven't created a no-pack situation, they're not really under any obligation to get up and join the pack, so long as they don't present a tripping hazard. By taking themselves out of the pack equation, once the front group of 3 blockers is past the pivot line and more than 10 feet in front of the rear pair of Gotham blockers, the inside pack ref signals pack is here and the jammers are released. As soon as that rear pair of Philly blockers stands, They form the pack with the rear pair of Gotham blockers, and they are soon joined by the Gotham blocker coming out of the box. They do engage the Gotham jammer at an ideal area in the track, but they lose her. The forward pair of Philly blockers, while not part of the pack, are still in play and engage that Gotham jammer as long as they're able. Gotham does ultimately get lead. This was some good strategy for Philly, who was struggling for maintaining control of the rear of the pack over Gotham, who seemed to use this play so effectively this bout. What I like about this next clip is it demonstrates very nicely the concepts of yielding and derby. We're going to see 3 different kinds of yields and the impacts that they have on play. It's late in the first period. Gotham is ahead 61-26. Both teams each have a blocker in the box. Let's take a look, before we look at the clip, at some of the yielding that's happening on the track. The first yield we see is one of Gotham's blockers standing behind the jammer line. Officially, this is considered yielding a 4th minor. Unofficially, we call this poodling. Here's a little bit on the history and a strategy of this particular play. Many teams, especially those who had a very shallow jammer rotation, such as 2 or 3 potential jammers on a team, found they didn't want to put a jammer on the jam line who had 3 minors because 1 minor infraction, and that jammer was going to sit in the box for a minute, leaving the team in a situation where they were unable to score for a minute. Trying to intentionally get a minor by engaging the other team is dangerous and, frankly, douchebaggery. The most dangerous part being there's no guarantee your efforts will result in only a minor or even a minor. Attempting procedural minor penalties while in play were not always noticed. So this procedure of making a really obvious minor penalty, false starting by being out of position as a blocker prior to the jam start whistle, became the easiest, safest, and least douchebag way to earn a 4th minor. Plus, it has the advantage of allowing the blocker to be as close as possible to the box when getting the minor, so there's no time lost in skating there. Starting behind the jammer line happens when the penalty box is between the jammer and pivot lines, as that's the closest point on the track to the box while still being out of position at the jam start. Since the box can be anywhere in the track, this particular pooling position can also shift around the track depending on where the penalty box is located. A note of procedure. Blockers who do this usually make sure they have the attention of an appropriate pack or head referee. Referees usually will not blow a whistle when issuing this 4th minor because doing so after the jam start, but before the jammer start whistle, is undeniably confusing. Blockers should not go to the box without being sure a referee has issued the physical signal for this penalty, motion for minors, even if there's no whistle. Going to the box on 3 does not help your team. Taking a look at the little graphic I've provided is 4 possible positions for the box location. Blockers who want to yield their 4th minor should make sure they are on the point of the track closest to the entrance to the penalty box, yet outside of the in-play starting position for blockers. The term poodling was initially used by referees to refer to something noteworthy on the track amongst themselves. Referees are forbidden to coach or make signals or statements which give one team an advantage, so they used a term that would indicate something was happening that the skaters should not become aware of through their actions. Poodle was intended as a completely benign, non-derby term. Of course, in our early history here, we all practiced together, and yielding the 4th was the most common action which earned a poodle designation from referees to call attention to, so it has since become known as poodling. Its official description is yielding the 4th minor, but poodling is easier to say and a common derby term. A note of strategy. For teams that have a deeper jammer rotation, poodling is often a poor waste of a good skater's time in the box. Let's take a look at the other 2 yields in this jam, both by the pivots of the 2 respective teams. The Gotham pivot has yielded her position on the pivot line. During this bout, having a back pair of blockers has been a winning strategy for Gotham. She has clearly chosen to not line up in front of the pack. Pivots are not required to line up in front of the pack. In Rule 4.2.2, pivot starting position. Pivots generally line up in the front of the pack. Only the pivots may line up on the pivot line. And 4.2.3, non-pivot blocker starting positions. Blockers line up behind the pivots as demarked by the hips. If a pivot is not on the pivot line, non-pivot blockers are not required to line up behind her. In addition to controlling the back, this position for Gotham's pivot leads to a strategy of bridging, which affects a 6-second penalty burn for her blocker in the box. Less obvious in this image is the fact that the Philly pivot is also not on the line, and she too is yielding the pivot line. It was a couple years into play before teams started really working this rule. In more words than Rule 4.2.3, you have to line up behind any pivot who is on the pivot line. But if no pivot is on the pivot line, you don't have to line up behind the pivots. What the Philly pivot has done is take advantage of the fact Gotham has yielded the pivot line entirely. She has herded her own blockers up there with her and pulled her skate off the line, something I call the pivot pull-off. By doing so, blockers do not have to be behind either pivot, and her own blockers may actually start slightly ahead of her. This gives Philly the dominant position of controlling the front of the pack at the jam start whistle. It's fairly rare to see this when both pivots are on the track, as it is a much more common strategy when one pivot is in the box. But a good pivot and her blockers will be aware of this opportunity when it presents itself. Another historical note: if you've ever heard the canned Derby demo script say, "The role of the pivot is to control the pace of the pack and act as the last line of defense," know that in WFTDA rules, it is not ever required, and none of these are required strategies. There are only two special roles of the pivot: the ability to start on the pivot line and the ability to become a jammer through a successful cover pass. The idea of the pivot setting the pace is a holdover from bank track rules where the pack always had to skate behind the pivots. In that way, the pivots indeed controlled the speed of the pack and acted as a last line of defense. WFTDA has never required this in their flat track rules. Let's take a look at how this jam plays out. While the point of this clip was to demonstrate the concepts of yielding and derby, I'll quickly go over what happened in this jam. Gotham burns 6 seconds with a bridge. They tie up the Philly jammer for a few seconds in the odd corner, but by the even corner, Philly's jammer is able to do a quick apex jump around the inside of the two-skater Gotham wall. Gotham's jammer misreads the pack and ends up getting tangled in her own blockers. Philly takes the lead 12 seconds in the backside straightaway. In this clip, we're early in the second period. Philly's behind, but they are actually closing the gap, probably for the last time in this bout. The lineups are interesting. Gotham has a full box. They have a pivot, blocker, and jammer the box, and they have another blocker on the track that has to go to the box when there's a seat. What I like most about this clip, especially with the historical context now 18 months later, is that this is a fine example that taking a knee down, even when you have the pack advantage, is not always the best strategic approach to starting a jam. Let's take a look.
Clarification on Gotham blocker Ginger snaps will be in the penalty box.
The squirrel jamming for the Liberty Bells. We're starting this one off as a power jam. So, you look like Jersey's on the track, but the squirrel's trying to make it around, and otherwise, she gets through to become lead jammer for the Liberty Bells.
Okay, let's take a look at what just happened. Gotham burns 4 seconds with a bridge. This leaves a pretty slow pack, and their forward blocker skates back to wall up for an odd corner defense. Philly's blockers naturally follow that blocker back, and that creates a negative effective pack speed, which is ideal when you have the only jammer. Gotham's blockers focus on the inside to go for a quick hit on the pivot line and don't see the offensive blocks from their right. Philly earns lead at 11 seconds, 90 feet from the jammer line, and the pack is hardly moving. In our last slide, we see probably one of the first instances of an entire pack taking a knee before the jam start whistle. Let's take a look at the clip and we'll look at what happens after.
Now there's no pack and the jammer whistle goes right away.
The bull is on the jammer line for the Liberty Bells rocker.
Taking a look across
There, good
the
job.
stat sheet,
Nice.
Philly running 6 jammer rotation, Gotham only running 3, maybe 4 at the most. Wow.
While throughout the course of 2011, knee-down starts seemed to become the norm, this particular jam is one of the first instances in sanctioned play that we see a knee-down start employed by an entire pack of skaters on the track. And in this case, it's Philly that's doing it. They do have a slight pack advantage, and it is to their advantage to get this jam started as quickly as possible, since while they have a blocker off the track just as Gotham does, they have a pivot and Gotham doesn't. So they're taking advantage of this, and it would work for them. Except that Gotham's jammer engages in some jammer-on-jammer action as they approach the back of the pack, and ultimately Gotham does get lead. But the strategy is sound, and anyone who's watched any streamed bouts over the internet since the fall of 2010 has seen a lot of these jams in play, and a lot of them work. But here's a chance to just see where it started, and see what happens out of it. I do believe that Philly might have had just as good of an opportunity here if they had skated and worked the pack over the line as opposed to using the knee down. But it's hard to say. Gotham clearly had the stronger packs, the smarter sense, and the better skill in this particular bout. But there was a lot to learn from it, and it was a really exciting bout to see. Thanks for watching my clips on the 2010 Eastern Regional Jam Starts. I look forward to your comments and feedback. Stay tuned here on YouTube for more Jam Start video from the 2011 Blood and Thunder World Cup. There's a lot of stuff on the new Scrum Start or Charlie's Angel Start, depending on what you call it. Looking forward to giving you more strategy and more video. Basically, getting the word out there what an exciting sport roller derby is. Drop me a line here on YouTube or on my webpage, promiseofderby.com.